I'm an associate professor of philosophy here at Fort Hays State University, and this mini lecture is called What is Philosophy? The goal of the lecture today is to give you a little taste of the discipline of philosophy and to talk a little bit about its content and methods. Because this lecture is intended for a variety of courses, it may be that you and I have a lot of contact over the course of the next weeks and months to come, or it may be that your professor of record is someone other than myself. The title of the lecture is broad enough that it may be used in introductory courses on ethics or courses in applied ethics or even a logic course. So nonetheless, I welcome you to the virtual college program here at Fort Hays and to the study of philosophy. For most of you, if not all of you, this will be your first substantive take on philosophy. That is your first class where you're going to be thinking philosophically and studying great philosophers. The course you are taking is also largely new to you. That is to say, most of you are not philosophy majors and are not majoring or minoring in a discipline close to philosophy. So why are you taking a philosophy course then? Many of you are wondering that perhaps right now. It's because, at least in part, the major programs see value in the skills and the thinking that philosophy courses provide for your major. So whether you're a business major or a finance major, or you're majoring in health or life sciences, philosophy has some value for you, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. The discipline of philosophy is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, discipline known to humanity. Both in the Eastern sphere and in the West here, we have philosophers dating back as far back as 500 years before the Common Era. In the East, those ancient figures would be people like Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, or Confucius. And in the West, we have such wonderful philosophers as Plato and Aristotle in the ancient tradition. The discipline of philosophy is not normally taught at the high school or elementary school levels, and so it's particularly appropriate that we spend a little bit of time just introducing the subject matter and the discipline itself. There are lots of definitions of philosophy. In the West, one of the oldest and most revered is Plato's definition of philosophy as the love of wisdom. In the Department of Philosophy here at Fort Hays State, we came up with our own definition, which is somewhat similar to that. We define philosophy as the unbounded pursuit of a meaningful life through rational inquiry. So let's take a little closer look at some of the key words in that definition. The first that might jump out at you, depending on how much exposure you've had to philosophy in the past, is the word love. Philosophers are after not just a love of knowledge, but a love of truth, but a love of knowledge. And this love is an affective dimension. That is to say, we have feelings about the pursuit of a meaningful life, and we have a desire to embrace it as another person would embrace a friend who they love. The second word that we might point out here is the word wisdom. In philosophy, we are interested not just in knowledge or knowledge for its own sake, but we are after knowledge which will lead to wisdom. And wisdom, as you may have surmised here, involves action or good living, right? So, in philosophy, we are lovers of wisdom. That is, we care deeply, we love not just the accumulation of knowledge, but the pursuit of knowledge which will lead to better living. And of course, although there are many different ways which we might live better and many different ways in which we pursue or acquire knowledge, philosophers are after the kind of wisdom which would allow them to live well over the course of their lives and in all facets of their life. That is, not just living well financially or living well in terms of our relationships, but all of those and others besides. The second definition which I gave you involved the word unbounded. In philosophy, there are no questions off limits. As we'll see here a little later, in other disciplines, the nature of the discipline means that the inquiry, the investigation, is limited in certain respects. In philosophy, there is great pride taken in the fact that all questions are welcome, even skeptical questions or questions about the value of doing anything, even the value of doing philosophy. So in a philosophy course, you are going to be exposed to all kinds of questions. Some of the questions may not have appeared to you before, or you may not have had concern or reason to think about them before. And that's part of the nature of philosophy. Another key word is the word meaningful. The pursuit is unbounded, but the goal is to lead a meaningful life. And as you may know or may guess, the definition of meaningful will vary from one person to the next. And so philosophers are interested, again, not just in acquiring or compiling facts, but about using them in a way that leads to a wise set of choices and a meaningful and fruitful life. And last, and again we'll talk about this here a bit more in a moment, is the word rational. Philosophers, particularly in the West, although also in the East, have seen the pursuit of wisdom as, in philosophical terms, as a rational one where we use our cognitive powers, our thinking powers, that is, we use reason. And we use reason to pursue then the wise life or the search for a meaningful life. So these are some of the key terms in those two definitions I gave you, and you'll have access to the slides which I'm looking at now, which will give the definitions to you if you wish further. Let's look then at some of the critical or key aims of philosophy. That is, what else can we say about what philosophy hopes to do? The first is the critical scrutiny of our own beliefs or our current beliefs. Of course, all of us, whether we're conscious of it or not, have beliefs about what it is to be human, about right and wrong, good or bad. And philosophy seeks to submit those to cross-examination. A second aim then, related to the first, is the uncovering of hidden beliefs or assumptions. So perhaps I had assumed that democracy was the best form of government because I had assumed that there was a God who created us all equal. And that hidden assumption, or relatively hidden assumption about there being a God or having created human beings equal, would affect or underlie my belief about the importance of democracy. So in a course like this, you should have ample opportunity to submit your beliefs to critical scrutiny and also to uncover perhaps some of your underlying assumptions about the subject matter at hand. The third and very important critical aim, which I'll put up on the board here, is to improve your critical thinking skills. One of the reasons that philosophers are involved in business courses and in courses in the health and life sciences and all other kinds of courses is because philosophy has a long history of improving critical thinking skills and what are sometimes called higher order thinking skills, like analysis, being able to take a complicated idea and pull it apart, and the opposite of that, which is synthesis, to put together a complicated set of ideas and so forth, and of course logical reasoning, learning how to identify and argue in a logical, valid fashion as opposed to illogical or fallacious, false kinds of reasoning. So those are some of the critical thinking skills, and there are others that are important aims of philosophy. Fourthly, the fourth key aim of philosophy is to pose certain questions and to try and answer certain questions which the other disciplines do not try to answer. And we'll talk a little bit about science here in a bit, but many of these have to do with value questions, although not all of them. And finally, and again this ties back to our provisional set of definitions, philosophy aims to identify a path towards a meaningful life. So those are some key aims of philosophy. There are three recognized divisions or types of philosophical questions, and there are various subsets within these three divisions. The first division is what is sometimes called metaphysics. I think I might shift over to a different color here. Oh, much better. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy which studies questions about ultimate reality. So a common metaphysical question is, does God exist? Is God real or a figment of our imagination? Another great metaphysical question, are colors real? So the various shades of brown in my tie, according to science, are wavelengths, which bounce off the back of my retina and register as what we call brown. But is that all there is to the color brown, or is there something more to it? Do colors disappear when we analyze them? A second branch of philosophical questioning deals with what is called epistemology. Epistemological questions have to do with how we know, and questions about truth or falsity, questions about kinds of knowledge are epistemological questions. And lastly, sometimes called axiology, which is a fancy word for value theory. And in value theory, we have questions about the origin of values, where values come from, whether they're universal or relative. So you get ethics, political philosophy, and also aesthetics deals with value questions. So the particular course that you're taking this semester from Fort Hays may be more or less concentrated in one of these three areas, or if it's an introduction to philosophy course, you might spend some time in each of the three areas listed there. I would like to, before we go too much further, make a brief point about the difference between philosophical content and philosophical method. In each of these three areas, we might identify important figures. Aristotle's view of metaphysics, or Confucius's view of the importance of virtue or rights. In this case, we would be looking at other people's answers and considering their arguments for or against particular metaphysical, epistemological, or axiological questions. That is the study of content. When you read or learn about other people's ideas on important philosophical issues, you're learning about philosophy by studying its content. But it's also important to note that there is a philosophical method. Just as in science we might have a particular scientific object of inquiry, which is separate from the scientific method. Right? The method is applied to the object of inquiry. In philosophy, we have lots of objects of inquiry, areas where we inquire, but we have one method, and that method is to engage, using reason, to engage these important issues, to seek out the best reasons for holding or rejecting beliefs, ideas, theories, and also, of course, to test them against our own experience. So, if your philosophy class is successful, at the end of the semester, you will have looked at some philosophical content and studied some other people's ideas, but you should have also engaged those ideas to argue about them with your professor, with your colleagues, with your friends, and to have tested your own beliefs against your own experience and against other people's claims to truth. All right, let's take a look at the difference then in the philosophical method or approach and two other important areas of inquiry. Philosophy is not the same as science, and it's not the same as religion. And I'll put West down there because our idea of religion in the West is somewhat different than perhaps the connotations that the word brings up in the East. Science is committed to the empirical method, that is, using observation, hypothesis, testing, and review of results as a way of getting to truth. Philosophy is not necessarily committed to the empirical method. That is to say, observation is valued, but is not assumed to be the only or even necessarily the primary method by which one comes to understand truth. So that's one big difference between philosophy and science. A second difference has to do with the question of value. Science, at least as strictly speaking, as scientists, are not engaged in questions of ought. That is, science might be able to tell us, for example, that we can build a nuclear bomb. But whether we should build a nuclear bomb is not something which science itself can answer. So science is not prescriptive. To prescribe is to say that we ought or we should do something. And those are questions of value or ethics. Sorry, I'm writing sideways there. And science, strictly speaking, again, can tell us lots of things, but it does not, as a science, does not tell us whether we should be involved in those things. So this is a big difference between philosophy and science. And as I already mentioned then, philosophy is broader than science in that it will consider non-empirical means to truth and will question even the value of, for example, the scientific method. But that's not to say that philosophers are any better or worse than scientists, but just that it's a different discipline. Philosophy is often confused with religion, particularly here in the West. And although it's too simple to say that they're entirely different, there are some important differences, and I'll just point one or two of them out here for you this morning, and you can consider this as you go forward in the course. In religion, most religions, although not all, will accept beliefs, religious theories on authority. So sometimes the authority is a book. For example, almost all the world religions have sacred books, sacred scriptures. Or it might be a sacred person, right? So if you believe in Catholic Christianity, the Pope holds a special religious authority. And if the Pope says something is good or bad, right or wrong, you don't need another argument for it. In philosophy, no position is sacred. That is, all beliefs, all positions are able to be questioned, and all should be submitted to the test of reasoning, to the cognitive processes we discussed a little bit earlier. So when you're in a philosophy class, you're not going to be, or you shouldn't be given, a lot of content to memorize and let it stay at that. Nor should you simply take as true what other thinkers, other philosophers have believed. Because in all these cases, we want to know the reasons why and to submit these to critical inquiry. All right. The last thing I do as I wind this up here today is to encourage you a little bit to take this opportunity to do philosophy seriously. And I say that for a couple of reasons. First of all, we all as human beings are full of beliefs, and we have all kinds of assumptions about what is right and wrong, what is good and bad, how we ought to make our decisions in life. And we all have ideas, personal ideas about what it is to be human, about what a happy life will look like. And if you've lived long enough, which most of you no doubt have, you know that other people do not share those beliefs necessarily, all of them or any of them. And so especially in a globalized world where we're confronted with beliefs all over the spectrum and all different kinds, it is a good idea to study philosophy. Philosophy is, I think, more important now than perhaps it ever was. This is particularly true for those of us who happen to be living in a democracy, because it is, of course, in a democracy the people who make the choices and not religious or political figures, at least in theory, separated from the people. And finally, you have a philosophy of life, and you have a rare chance here and now this semester to think about the issues of your course, of your particular section, to think about why you believe what you believe and whether or not you should continue to believe it. It will take intellectual courage. We mostly think of courage as being a physical sort of thing, but it takes intellectual courage to question your own beliefs and to consider seriously the views of others. It will take some humility to realize that you perhaps don't have all the answers, and it will take some perseverance. That is, sticking to the task when it gets hard, and in a philosophy class the thinking does tend to get hard, and so to continue with it takes the virtue of intellectual perseverance. But you have a rare opportunity to do this in this class. When you get out into the real world, or you get out and get a job or continue the job that you have, most people will not consider these questions very deeply. So this is a rare opportunity for you. And the ocean of philosophy is wide and deep, and there are a lot of questions which we perhaps don't have answers to now. But I would encourage you to jump right in. The temperature is just fine. And of course, there's no time like the present.